The Brooklyn courtroom had seen everything: raised voices, desperate pleas, rehearsed lies, and carefully crafted truths. It was a place where adults argued, careers were made or destroyed, and verdicts were often decided long before anyone spoke. But that morning felt different. The usual tension was there, thick and heavy, yet something else hung in the air, an uneasy silence, the kind that settles just before something unexpected happens. From the last row, a small figure slowly rose to his feet. An 8-year-old boy. His movements were hesitant, almost cautious, as if he understood that every step he took forward crossed an invisible line meant only for adults. He clutched a worn, slightly bent folder to his chest with both hands, holding it like armor. His name was Marcus Johnson, too young to comfortably reach the microphone, too small to look intimidating. Yet somehow, without raising his voice or making a scene, he drew the attention of the entire courtroom. Whispers stopped, papers rustled, then stilled. Even the jury shifted in their seats. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady despite the weight of the room pressing down on him. "May I please say something for my grandmother?" The words were simple, almost fragile, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water. Judge William Carter froze mid-sentence. His pen hovered above the page as he slowly looked up over his glasses, eyes locking onto the boy. In more than 30 years on the bench, he had witnessed emotional breakdowns, dramatic confessions, and theatrical defenses, but never this. Never a child. Never like this. At the defense table, Dorothy Johnson, Marcus's grandmother, sat with her hands tightly folded in her lap. At 72 years old, her shoulders were slightly hunched, not from age alone, but from exhaustion, the kind that comes from fighting a battle you were never meant to fight alone. The chair beside her was empty. Her attorney had withdrawn the night before, unpaid, overwhelmed, and unwilling to stand against a case that everyone seemed convinced was already decided. Dorothy had spent 15 years running a housing assistance program in Brooklyn, helping struggling families find safe places to live. Now she sat accused of stealing nearly $17,500 from the very organization she had dedicated her life to protecting. The prosecutor was calm, confident, almost bored. The paperwork pointed to her name. The signatures were there. The system had already drawn its conclusion. To the court, Dorothy Johnson was just another case file. But to Marcus, she was everything. And while the system had already decided her fate, Marcus hadn't. "Son," Judge Carter said gently, resting his pen on the bench, "this isn't the place for children." Marcus felt his throat tighten, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he took a slow breath, the kind his grandmother had taught him to take whenever fear tried to win. "I know, sir," he said softly, "but my grandma has a heart condition, and stress makes her sick." The words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded lived in. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Others looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with how human the moment felt. At the prosecution table, David Richardson leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a faint smirk. He had seen emotional tactics before: tears, dramatic speeches, desperate relatives clinging to false hope. To him, this was no different. "This is highly inappropriate," Richardson objected sharply, straightening his expensive suit. "A child cannot interfere in legal proceedings. This court is not a stage for sympathy." Marcus turned his head slowly toward him. "I'm not here to interfere, sir," he said with surprising calm. "I'm here to tell the truth." That sentence landed heavier than anyone expected. The room went still. Judge Carter studied the boy closely, not seeing defiance, not fear, but something far more unsettling. Certainty, the kind that doesn't beg for permission. The judge leaned forward, folding his hands together. In 3 decades, he had learned to recognize many things in defendants: guilt, desperation, arrogance. But what stood before him now was none of those. "Very well," Judge Carter finally said. "You will have 5 minutes. As a witness only." Richardson exhaled sharply, irritation flashing across his face. 5 minutes was more than enough to waste the court's time, or so he thought. Marcus nodded once, respectfully. Then he stepped forward, and in that single step, the balance of the room shifted. Because for the first time that morning, the system was no longer speaking. The truth was about to. Marcus placed the folder on the wooden podium. It made a soft sound, but in the silence of the courtroom, it felt loud. This wasn't a child's school folder. It was worn, reinforced with tape at the corners, the kind used by someone who opened it again and again. The edges of the papers inside were color-coded. Tabs stuck out neatly from the side. The jury noticed immediately. These were not random pages. They were prepared. "These aren't guesses," Marcus said calmly. "They're records." He opened the folder carefully, as if each page mattered, because to him, it did. "My grandma and I checked her accounts every Sunday night," he continued. "At the kitchen table. After dinner." A faint smile crossed his face, then disappeared. "She said numbers don't lie, but people sometimes do." A few jurors shifted in their seats. Marcus lifted the first page. "She taught me how to organize everything," he explained. "Blue papers for money going out, yellow for money coming in, white for notes." He held up a blue tab document. "On September 12th, $2,500 was withdrawn for emergency roof repairs at the community center." He paused, just long enough, then raised a photo. "We went there the next day." The image was slightly blurry, taken with an old phone, but clear enough. The roof was intact. No ladders, no tools, no workers, no repairs, Marcus said quietly. A murmur ran through the jury. At the prosecution table, Richardson adjusted his collar. Marcus flipped to the next tab. "On September 18th, $1,800 for new security cameras." He looked up, but the old cameras were still there. Same wires, same broken angles. He glanced briefly toward the judge. "I know because my grandma complained they never worked." Judge Carter leaned forward now, eyes fixed on the documents. Marcus continued, "And then on September 25th, he hesitated, not out of fear, but wait. $3,200 for outside legal counsel." The courtroom felt tighter. "My grandma never hired any outside lawyers," Marcus said. "She always handled paperwork herself or got help for free." He turned slowly toward the prosecution. "Sir," Marcus said politely, "did you verify that the companies receiving this money actually exist?" The question hung in the air. Richardson didn't answer immediately. He shifted in his chair. "The investigation focused on administrative responsibility," he said finally, his voice controlled but tense. Marcus nodded. "Once." "So," he said gently, "you didn't check. No accusation. No anger. Just truth." And somehow, that made it worse. A few jurors exchanged looks, no longer curious, no longer skeptical. Concerned. Because what stood before them now wasn't a child playing detective. It was a case that had never truly been investigated. And everyone in that room could feel it. Marcus flipped to another section of the folder. This time, the paper made a sharper sound. Thicker, more deliberate. "These signatures," he said quietly, "they aren't my grandma's." He placed two sheets side by side on the podium. One was taken from the official withdrawal forms. The other from Dorothy Johnson's personal notebooks, grocery lists, meeting notes, handwritten reminders. "They look similar at first," Marcus continued, "but only if you don't really look." He lifted the pages slightly, angling them toward the jury. "My grandma's handwriting is soft," he explained. "She presses lightly because her hands hurt sometimes." He traced the air with his finger. "These ones are heavy. The pen digs into the paper. That's someone rushing or someone nervous." A juror in the front row leaned forward. Another squinted, comparing the curves. Marcus didn't rush. "I learned the basics of handwriting analysis at the public library," he said. "They had a book in the reference section. I asked the librarian if kids were allowed to read it." A faint, almost sad smile appeared. She said justice doesn't have an age limit. At the prosecution table, Richardson let out a sharp scoff, loud enough to be heard. "We're trusting forensic analysis from a child now," he snapped. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. Marcus looked up, calm, steady, unshaken. "Sir," he said politely, "did you bring a professional handwriting expert to confirm these signatures?" Silence. Not the awkward kind. The dangerous kind. Richardson opened his mouth, closed it, adjusted his tie. The judge watched him carefully. "No," Richardson finally muttered. "We did not deem it necessary." Marcus nodded slowly. "I see." He turned back to the jury. "So there is no expert testimony proving my grandma signed these documents," he said evenly. "And there is evidence that she usually signs differently." He paused. "Which means at the very least, someone else could have signed them." That word, could, landed hard. Not an accusation. A possibility. And in a courtroom, possibility changes everything. One juror crossed her arms, jaw tight. Another glanced at Dorothy Johnson, who sat frozen, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Marcus noticed and softened his voice. "My grandma always told me," he said, "that the law isn't about winning. It's about being careful with the truth." He gathered the papers back into the folder, carefully, like they mattered, because they did. And for the first time since the trial began, the question in the room was no longer, did Dorothy Johnson steal the money? It was, how did we miss this? "And there's something else," Marcus said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. But something in the room shifted. He reached into the folder again and pulled out a thinner stack of papers, creased, slightly worn, as if they'd been handled many times before. Hospital records. He held them with both hands, almost respectfully. On the day the money was transferred, Marcus continued, "My grandma wasn't at a bank." He paused. "She was with me, in the emergency room." A low murmur moved through the courtroom. Marcus swallowed once, then went on. "I had a severe asthma attack that afternoon. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die." His fingers tightened on the papers. "She rushed me to St. Mary's Hospital herself. She didn't leave my side." He lifted the documents higher. "These records show our check-in time." He read slowly, clearly, so no one could miss it. 1:07 p.m. He flipped the page. Doctor's notes. Nurse logs. Medication administered. Another pause. She was there continuously until 5:02 p.m. The judge leaned forward. Marcus turned slightly toward the jury. "The bank transaction the prosecution claims my grandma made," he said, "happened at 2:30 p.m. A ripple of shock crossed several faces. Marcus laid the pages out on the podium, one by one. Timestamps, doctor signatures, hospital ID numbers, security desk verification. All original copies, he added, requested directly from the hospital records department. Dorothy Johnson pressed a hand to her mouth, tears finally falling freely. Marcus didn't look at her, not yet. "She never left the ER," he said quietly. "She was holding my hand while I was hooked up to a breathing machine." At the prosecution table, Richardson's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. "These documents weren't submitted during discovery," he barked. "This is highly irregular." Marcus turned toward him, calm but firm. "Sir," he said, "did you submit proof that my grandma was physically present at the bank at 2:30 p.m.? Richardson froze. The judge raised an eyebrow. Marcus didn't stop. "Because if she was with me in the emergency room," he continued, "then she couldn't have been signing documents or authorizing transfers or committing fraud." The room felt suddenly smaller. Richardson opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw tightened. The judge spoke slowly. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "do you dispute the authenticity of these hospital records?" Silence. Not a single word. Marcus let that silence stretch. Then he said the sentence that sealed it. "So if the timeline doesn't work, then the accusation doesn't work either. No anger, no drama, just logic." And in that moment, the case against Dorothy Johnson didn't just weaken. It collapsed. Marcus didn't rush. For the first time since he'd taken the stand, he closed the folder. Slowly, deliberately. The sound echoed louder than it should have. "There's one more thing," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, but every single person in the courtroom felt it. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a plain white envelope. No markings, no labels. He placed it on the podium and looked up, not at the jury this time, at the prosecutor, directly at Richardson. "This recording," Marcus continued, "was made on a publicly recorded office line, the kind used for official government business." Richardson shifted in his seat, just slightly, but the jury noticed. Marcus pressed the button. The click sounded sharp. Then, Richardson's voice filled the courtroom. Clear, confident, unfiltered. "It doesn't matter if she's guilty. My conviction rate can't drop before the election." The reaction was immediate. A woman in the jury gasped and covered her mouth. Another juror shook his head slowly, disbelief written across his face. Dorothy Johnson's shoulders began to tremble. The recording continued. Another voice, lower, careless, cruel. "She's just an old black woman. Who's going to believe her?" The room froze. No murmurs this time. No whispers. Just shock. Judge Carter slowly removed his glasses. He didn't speak right away. He looked at the ceiling, then at the jury, then finally at Richardson. "Mr. Richardson," the judge said, his voice tight but controlled, Is that your voice on this recording? Richardson stood abruptly. That recording has been taken out of context, he said quickly. I demand. The judge raised a single hand. Sit down. Richardson hesitated. Security officers at the side of the courtroom took one step forward. Richardson swallowed and sat. Marcus pressed stop. The silence afterward was heavier than the audio. That recording was obtained through a public records request, Marcus added calmly. It was logged, time-stamped, and verified. He turned to the jury. My grandma didn't just lose her savings, he said. She lost her reputation, her dignity, her sleep. Dorothy let out a quiet sob. Marcus finally looked at her. And all because someone needed good numbers for an election year. Judge Carter leaned forward. Bailiff, he said, escort Mr. Richardson outside. Richardson's face went pale. This is outrageous, he protested. You can't. Now, the judge said sharply. As security escorted him away, the courtroom doors opened. Cameras flashed outside. The jury watched in silence as a career ended. Not with shouting, not with force, but with truth. Marcus stood still. He hadn't raised his voice once. And yet, everyone in that room knew. This case was over. And so was Richardson's future. The courtroom was so quiet that even breathing felt loud. Judge Carter sat still for a long moment, eyes lowered, hands folded together. The weight of what had just been revealed hung heavy in the air. Not just evidence, but truth. Finally, he looked up. His voice was firm, unshaken. All charges against Dorothy Johnson are dismissed. Immediately, a sharp inhale rippled through the room. Judge Carter continued, slower now, each word deliberate. This court further orders a full and independent investigation into prosecutorial misconduct, abuse of power, and ethical violations connected to this case. Dorothy's knees buckled. She clutched the edge of the bench as tears streamed freely down her face. Not quiet tears, not polite tears, but the kind that come from months of fear finally breaking apart. Marcus moved instantly, steadying her, his hand firm but gentle on her arm. It's over, Grandma, he whispered. You're safe now. Dorothy tried to speak, but no words came. She simply shook her head, overwhelmed, one hand pressed to her chest, as if reminding herself she was still standing. Across the courtroom, jurors wiped their eyes. One juror stared at Marcus with open admiration. Another nodded slowly, as if committing this moment to memory forever. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses again, his voice softer now, human. Ms. Johnson, he said, this court apologizes for the hardship you endured. Justice delayed should never mean justice denied. Dorothy looked up. For the first time since this ordeal began, she smiled. Not wide, not proud, relieved. Marcus stepped forward. I didn't do this to hurt anyone, he said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. I just wanted my grandma to be safe. I wanted the truth to matter. No theatrics, no anger, just honesty. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then one clap, then another. Then the entire courtroom rose to its feet. Applause filled the room. Not loud, not celebratory, but respectful, powerful. Judge Carter didn't stop it. He simply watched. Outside the courtroom doors, reporters scrambled as the news spread instantly. Inside, Dorothy held Marcus's hand tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for me. For people like me. Marcus squeezed her hand back. No one should be afraid just because they don't have power, he replied. As the bailiff announced adjournment, the sound echoed differently this time. Not like an ending, but like a beginning. Because in that courtroom, justice didn't just win a case. It reclaimed a life. 6 months later, Marcus addressed a law school audience. Not as a student, but as a case study. Dorothy's housing program was restored. A new transparency law was passed. And the Marcus Project began teaching legal literacy to children across Brooklyn. Judge Carter keeps Marcus's photo on his desk. As a reminder, that justice doesn't always come in a suit. Sometimes, it comes with a small boy, a simple folder, and the courage to speak the truth.